I'm Daniel Bass, manager of the South Asia program at Cornell University.
And I'm Shavin Senavaratna, graduate student in architecture at Cornell and student worker at the South Asia program. Welcome back to Season 2 of the Next Monsoon podcast, where we'll be featuring interviews recorded during the conference alongside some snippets of conference presentations. Our first guest is Nida Rehman, one of the panelists at the conference. Nida is an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University School of Architecture. She shared some insights on her background and how the conference focused on community building had already sparked new ways to view her own work. Here's Nida Rehman.
My name is Nida Rehman. I'm an assistant professor in Carnegie Mellon, and I'm an urban geographer.
Welcome to the Next Monsoon podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, what have been your takeaways from the conference so far?
Right. So I think we're about a little bit over halfway through now, and it's been a really both warm, inviting, and also just intellectually very rich set of conversations the last day and a half. Couple of insights or couple of thoughts, very quick reflections that I might that I will take away. One is something that actually Nima just mentioned as we were walking out the room, and I really appreciated that point, which was this kind of bringing into the room in relation to very fresh, research in relation to the response, the prompt of the conference, with older conversations that have been happening amongst these sort of already formed communities of scholars that this convening sort of represents and brings together again. And that also, I think, resonates with me just like as an action to bring people together to do that with this idea of kind of retelling the stories, which is kind of part of what people are doing in their projects, in their kind of intellectual work, and in their sort of what the kind of politics of many of the kind of papers also are, right? Which is about kind of thinking, with people on the ground, communities, other scholars, artists, who we all think through, right? The broader kind of citational community of the work. So I think, and that's why I kind of appreciate a conference and a workshop like this, which makes very explicit community building in different forms.
And it's also bringing together so many different disciplines at the same time. And so in what you're saying, what is one word you'll describe the collective speaker's position in this conference? It could be one or two words to encapsulate the emotion or also the position of everyone.
I think maybe it's not, I don't think it encapsulates, but I think it is definitely one of the kind of core ideas has emerged again and again, which is Rupali Gupta's kind of insistence on focus on life, broadly interpreted. And I think that is something that I feel people in general are staying very true to and very sort of always cognizant of. Our theory making practices in whatever way are always contingent on the ground.
Maybe.
Sorry, that was not one word.
Nida earlier mentioned Nima Kudva and Rupali Gupta. Nima is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University, and Rupali, who appeared on Season 1 of The Next Monsoon, is a co-founder and professor at the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai, India.
We will now share Debashree Mukherjee's paper titled Migrant Messages, The Monsoon and Dreams of Being Heard. Debashree is a film and media scholar and an associate professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University in New York City. Here is Debashree Mukherjee.
So the monsoon in South Asia is definitely then a socio-cultural event that is saturated with symbolic meaning. As a multisensory and durational weather phenomenon, the monsoon is registered by the human body as light, sound, texture, and color. Each of these sensory experiences is laden with deep cultural meaning and can trigger a range of affective moods from joy and relief to trepidation and anxiety. In South Asian classical and folk traditions, the monsoon has been visualized through iconic tropes such as dark clouds, green foliage, and lightning. The monsoon is also deeply associated with the Ras Leela, or the divine dance of the cowherd god Krishna and his paramours. The rains in these images create an environment soaked with Shringar Ras, or the texture of the erotic. This tradition has also unsurprisingly pervaded Bombay cinema. But there was also another parallel trajectory to the monsoon as a semiotic carrier. This is indicated by Nida, I think, in her presentation yesterday, and underlined further by Ezra in her comments. During the later period of the colonial modern, the monsoon was reconstructed as the meta-emblem of India as a wild and unruly place, a climatic environment that provoked animal lusts, induced lethargic indolence, and nurtured wet, stifling diseases. This construction was in keeping with new climatic theories of race, hygiene, and civilization, which provided the scientific and moral justification for colonial conquest. And again, cinema was there. Thus, as a cultural and a historical subject, the monsoon has participated in several religious, ideological, and political projects that have shaped the Indian subcontinent, its inhabitants, its visitors, and its aggressors. The monsoon is exemplary of the imbrication of nature, culture, history, and geopolitical location. In media studies today, there is much interest in the cloud. Not the monsoon cloud, but the digital cloud of online storage. This is a typical description of that cloud. On the first page of Tang Hui Hu's very excellent book, A Prehistory of the Cloud. And I'm just going to read out a few lines from this opening page. Like the inaudible hum of the electrical grid at 60 hertz, the cloud is silent, in the background, almost unnoticeable. Because of its reliability and its ubiquity, the cloud is a particularly mute piece of infrastructure. It is just there, atmospheric, part of the environment. Until something goes wrong, that is. End of quote. Now, this formulation is a truism of infrastructure studies by now, that infrastructure serve as a silent, unnoticed background of everyday life, only made visible, often violently, in the case of breakdown. Now, the monsoon cloud is neither silent nor background. It is noisy and angry, accompanied by thunder and lightning. But then again, surely the monsoon cloud is not infrastructure. Now, there are ways to compare the monsoon cloud with the cloud of digital storage infrastructures, but I'm less interested in making that argument today. That is the argument of infrastructure as storage. But what I do want to take up is the circulatory aspect of the monsoon cloud as that which moves and which can make people move, which again is a bit like infrastructure. I choose circulation and communication as the central features of the monsoon, rather than the more static approach towards clouds as storage, as seen in contemporary media studies. So here's where I'm making a bit of a leap. I want to use the ancient messenger poem genre as my starting point, and I will explore 3 different forms and genres of lament, complaint, or demand made by a sender to a receiver via an intriguing messenger or medium. My interest is in the nature of the lament, its technique and its form, and its imagination of who the receiver is and what form of redress they might provide. Okay, So perhaps the most famous example of a cloud as medium is in Kalidasa's 6th century BCE poem, Meghadutam. In it, an exiled lover, a yaksha, entreats a monsoon cloud to carry a desperate message of yearning to his distant beloved. The cloud thus serves as a communication medium, one that mediates both distance and affect. There are two questions I think worth pondering here. The first question is posed by Kalidasa himself in the verse 5, so the very opening of the poem itself. Blended of mists and light, winds and water, can a mere cloud bear messages that only the living with keen senses and intelligence can convey? So as David Shulman elaborates on this passage, who would trust a cloud, a concoction of smoke, light, water, and wind with a verbal message of critical emotional significance? The answer, according to Shulman, is that lovers tortured by separation will appeal in their distress to anything or anybody. So what's interesting here is that at the very start of the poem, we have a direct meta-poetic statement where we know that we are in an imagined domain which has its own compelling power. And this was also still Shulman. So what I'm trying to say with this first kind of way of thinking about this is that the first question then helps us think about the world-creating aesthetic power of the monsoon cloud, which is also the question of the power of art itself in the form of this poem, a site of world-making. The second question is about the nature of communication itself. There is a spatial gulf between the lovers that must be bridged, and a messenger is needed to mediate this communicative rift between the lover and the beloved. Now, every journalist knows that there are three basic units to the communication process. There is a sender, there is a message, and there is a receiver. It's not as funny as we would think because these elementary units are also the premise of studies on politics and power in South Asia. That is, post-colonial studies, and just think subaltern studies, has a deep interest in semiotics and semiology, in the politics of representation, in having a voice, in getting that voice across, who can hear that voice. So in subalternity and in techniques of collective speaking back to power. As John Durham Peters has put it in his famous book, Speaking into the Air, communication is one of the characteristic concepts of the 20th century. It has become, and I'm just going to put some new books on the slide, communication has become central to reflections on democracy, love, and our changing times. Some of the chief dilemmas of our age, both public and personal, turn on communication or communication gone sour. Now, the lover in Meghadutam is in exile. He has been banished from his homeland and everything that he loves. He longs for return. This exilic figure, I think, is key to unlocking the affective power of the genre of the messenger poem, also known as the Sandesa Kavya. And the fact that the season in which the yaksha yearns most for his partner and for this idea of home is the monsoon. Now, while the monsoon is highly romanticized in South Asian folk traditions as a season conducive to erotic feeling, this same eroticization is premised on the spatial fact of separation. There are hundreds of songs about Savan that are actually about distance from the beloved. And the social reality that underlies this distance is frequently migration, which is why the song of the cloud is not very far from the song of the Bidesya. And that's something I'm thinking with because my next project is on indentured labor migration. Now, the female protagonist of these songs is often lamenting the departure of a migrant worker husband who is compelled by money to leave his young and beautiful wife behind in the village. This Birahin, who's singing these songs of Viraha, then sings in registers of complaint, lamenting the structural conditions of this highly material world that have forced this separation, and petitioning her husband to please stay loyal to her, because there'll be many other beautiful women in that foreign land. And what I'm trying to say is that we're starting to get closer to the special communicative and political semiotics, perhaps, of the monsoon. So here I want to shift to another messenger poem written many, many centuries later. In 1941, the Telugu writer Gurram Jashuva turned the genre of the classical messenger poems on its head in this work called Gabilam by positing a bat as a messenger of a different kind of lament, a protest against exile from the everyday rhythms of society. Gabilam is a direct response to Meghadutam by an anti-caste nationalist poet and is considered by some, particularly Chinnaya Jangam, as the first great Dalit epic of South Asia. In the preface, Jashuva says, I wrote this text keeping Kalidas as Meghdut in mind. The protagonist in Meghdut is sentenced to 1 year, but my hero was sentenced from birth for generations without end. So this protagonist is an unnamed cobbler, one who has chosen to remain celibate. So this is not about an erotics of separation from a young wife. This protagonist has chosen to remain celibate because he doesn't want to invite any future wife companion to share his life of hardship. The bat who enters accidentally into the cobbler's home is recruited to send a message not to the beloved, but to God himself, Ishvara, Shiva, who resides in Kailasha. Interestingly, even in Meghdut, the Yakshi lives in Alaka, in the realm of the Kailash. But this is more directly a petition to an idea of a sovereign. I'll end with a different form of migrant message. It doesn't go to any one addressee in particular, but it stays within a looping dream of the self. So this is from a film by Anamika Haksar, a film that Lalita Gopalan has written very beautifully about in her recent book. And there's a suggestion in this film that such dreams of the migrant workers might accumulate towards some kind of new future. The film is a very bleak film, but there's always this, Haksar doesn't want to foreclose any possibility of a future. It begins with a title card that declares, this film is culled from interviews and dreams of pickpockets, street vendors, small-scale factory workers, daily wage earners, domestic workers, loaders, rickshaw pullers, and many others laboring in the city of Shah Jahanabad, Old Delhi. Now, when I first saw this film, I saw it during the pandemic, and I was just incredibly stunned and confused and moved by it. But I didn't really see climate change in it. While thinking with this paper, I started to see it in a much more resonant way. The clip I'm going to show you is somewhere 2/3 into the film. We'll see 4 dream visions, each of which will turn into a nightmare, nightmares of the present and the past. And I think why they're so pertinent for us is because through the logic of dreaming, Anamika Haksar is able to present an analysis of informal urban labor that is acutely conscious of the relations between rural and urban, between gender and violence, and between climate change and homelessness. It is a work of irreverent and lacerating, I think, experimentation. It moves beyond the rhetorical form of direct address and goes straight to the unspoken world of dreaming. It is in this dream world that we realize that the time of climate's past and climate's future are deeply entangled. Thank you.
That was Debashree Mukherjee presenting a portion of her paper, Migrant Messages, The Monsoon and Dreams of Being Heard, at the next Monsoon Conference in October 2023 at Cornell. We could not play the entirety of our presentation, which included some wonderful film clips, which we weren't able to include for time and copyright reasons. But she brought together so many different ideas, which is pretty remarkable, from modern films to medieval messenger poetry in quite a remarkable way.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed seeing and hearing her talk through that last clip, the last video that she kind of ended her presentation on.
Yeah, I like how she focused on the emotional responses to the monsoon, how that kind of anticipation and excitement, but also the fear and the role of clouds as these things that circulate and move, but also these signs of the monsoon as the approaching clouds come, and then the poetry of the power of the clouds, and that, like, you know, that mixed feeling of both bringing, you know, water and life, but also perhaps destruction and so on, that like just so vividly captures, and she's an eloquent writer as well, and speaker is pretty remarkable.
That's it for today's episode of The Next Monsoon. Next time, we'll be talking to Nida Rehman, a professor of anthropology and South Asia studies at the University of Oxford, on her perspectives on the conference, and sharing Lalita Gopalan's presentation titled Reckonings and Speculations in Moving Image Practices. Lalita is an associate professor in the Department of Radio, Television, Film at the University of Texas at Austin.
We would like to give special thanks to Sam Lubowitz and Angelica Kramer at Cornell's Language Resource Center for their assistance with recording this podcast. Shivin Senavaratna not only co-hosts this podcast, but is also our editor. South Asia Program Administrator Gloria Lemus-Chavez provided production supervision. Funding for this podcast and the entire Next Monsoon project comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please follow the South Asia Program on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SAP Cornell. You've been listening to music by Gloria Lemus-Chavez and her partner Brandon Kane. Make sure to check out more of their work in the description links below.
The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cornell's Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, or any other official entity of Cornell University.
I'm Daniel Bass.
And I'm Shivin Senavaratna.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode for new conversations and stories on The Next Monsoon.